less likely than men to participate in the labor market, and they receive 18% lower wages. Also, 1 in 4 businesses is female-led. Although very entrepreneurial, women have less access to credit. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and even widened these gaps. Women have been the most affected in this crisis. Before the pandemic, female labor force participation was growing in the region, but the pandemic has been a major setback. Between February and September 2020, female employment in Latin America and the Caribbean fell by 17.7%, while male employment fell by 13.1%. In countries like Chile, more than 1 decade of advance has been lost. In this keynote speech session, we are going to talk about the gender pay gaps in the US and what are the factors behind this gap. I'm sure that all these learnings are going to be very helpful for understanding the situation also in Latin America and the Caribbean. I am honored today to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Francine Blau. Francine is Francis Perkins Professor of Industrial and Labor Relations and the Professor of Economics at Cornell University, a research associate of the NBER, and a research fellow of ISA, CISIFO, and DIW, the German Institute for Economic Research. For the audience, I would like to let you know that after the keynote speech, we have reserved some time for questions and answers. So please type any question in the Q&A box of the Zoom webinar at any time during Francine's presentation. And Francine, as you know, you have 45 minutes for your keynote speech. Thank you so much for being with us today and in this LACEA conference. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. We were chatting before the session started, and I did say that one of the very, very small silver linings, but nonetheless an important silver lining to the pandemic is this development of Zoom and the greater opportunities to share across scholarship, across wide geographic distances, and to interact. So I'm honored and delighted to be here. And thank you so much for the introduction, Laura. It was very insightful and helped, I hope, to link what I'm doing to the experience in many other countries. So today, as Laura said, I'm going to be focusing on the gender wage gap, which I think is an important topic, not just because wages are the price of labor and they're the labor income is the major source of income for most individuals, but because they're a good indicator of how women are doing across a variety of dimensions that we're not explicitly mentioning, like how do their occupations fare? How about their labor force participation? That affects their experience, which in turn affects their wages. So it's an important indicator, and also a major input into decision-making within households and families. So today, what I'm going to do in talking about wages is to look at new empirical evidence on the gender wage gap for the United States over the last 30 years or so. I do think this is interesting in general because the situation in the United States is quite similar to that in many advanced economies. And I'm going to use this brief review as a springboard to talk about the literature on explanations for the gender pay gap and policies. I'd like to make a number of acknowledgments. First and very foremost in many ways is I'm drawing on many years of joint work with Lawrence Kahn, my Cornell colleague and also my husband. and especially a recent paper we did in the Journal of Economic Literature. I'm also drawing on work with Larry and two excellent graduate students here at Cornell, Nikolai Babashko and Matthew Comey, on selection. And I do want to give Nikolai a plug. Nikolai is on the job market this year, and I strongly recommend if you're hiring in the area of applied economics that you consider him. I'm also going to briefly touch on some work that I have in progress with Larry, Matthew Comey, and Isaac Cohn here at Cornell on the impact of minimum wages. Well, let's just go right to the bottom line here. In this graph, I have the log wages of women relative to men, the gap, excuse me, the ratio. It's the ratio of wages of women to men for 2 years, 1980 and 2010. And I first look at the unadjusted gap, or excuse me, I'm sorry, the unadjusted ratio. And then I look at the ratio adjusted for human capital factors. And by that, I mean primarily education and actual labor market experience with a few other control variables. And then in the last specification, which we call the full specification, we additionally add information on the industry, occupation, and union status of workers. Now, the situation in 1980 was the situation that prevailed over many earlier years and a number of subsequent years. And we saw that women earned at that time only about, in the United States, only about 60% of what men earned. I should mention this is full-time workers, to focus on the group that has similar labor market commitment. Then if you control for education and experience, you get quite a boost, meaning those factors did play an extremely important role, with experience being the dominant factor. So why do men and women tend to differ in experience? Because traditionally, women moved in and out of the labor force based on their family responsibilities, and that had a negative effect on their earnings. In the United States, they also were slightly less well educated, meaning that men were more likely to attend and graduate college than women. And then the ratio was further increased if you controlled for industry, occupation, and unionism, and all of those factors were quite important. So this, in a way, is the picture that I grew up with. But today, or roughly today, in 2010, there have been some major changes. And the biggest one is between these first two. Well, first of all, let me just say a big increase in the ratio, a lot of progress, getting us from about 60% to almost 80%. But look at these two bars. There's hardly any difference between them. And these two bars summarize actually a very big idea that Claudia Golden has put out of a quiet revolution in gender roles, with women getting much more attached to the labor force and experience differences between men and women greatly, greatly shrinking, but not entirely eliminated. The other really big thing that is absolutely fascinating and deserves a keynote on its own, and is true virtually throughout the economically advanced countries and many of the developing countries, is that women have not only caught up to men, they now actually surpass men in education. So when you take into account women's advantage in education and still their slight shortfall in experience, you only explain a little bit of the pay gap. Although industry and occupation, not unionism, but industry and occupation continue to be quite important. explanatory factors. Moreover, another thing this graph shows is that in both years, these numbers are not 100%. And the difference between 100% and these ratios is the unexplained gap, which is potentially due to discrimination. I'd like to say this is a quite detailed study, which does have information, as I've mentioned a few times, on actual experience, but also on a number of occupations and industries where their gender differences can be controlled for. But we still have a shortfall for women. So it could be a measure of discrimination, but we also understand it could reflect unmeasured factors. And in an issue that I'm going to return to, it could also be influenced by selection. And by selection, I mean who chooses to participate in the labor force. And under certain circumstances, self-selection into the labor force can bias our estimates of the gender pay gap. Putting it differently, it's not random who's in the labor force. So that's what these numbers tell us, and they also hint at why the ratio, the gender ratio, increased so much over this period. First of all, women, as I've already mentioned, increased their education relative to men. They increased their experience greatly relative to men. They actually, although it's not as obvious here, they upgraded their occupations relative to men. And in particular, they very markedly in the United States entered traditionally male managerial and professional jobs, including law and medicine that are quite high paying. See here that the unexplained gap shrank, which could reflect a decline in discrimination. My own personal opinion is that it does, but it could also reflect women's improvement in their unmeasured characteristics and some shifts in selection that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So before I look at the selection issue, I'd like to address the question, how are more skilled women faring? Because this is something else that is true in the United States, but has been noted across a number of countries where it's been examined. And that is the gender wage gap has closed more slowly at the top than at than the middle and the bottom of the wage distribution. So it seems like more highly skilled women are faring worse relative to their male counterparts than less skilled women. And this is true both unadjusted and controlling for covariates. So these numbers are based on quantile regression analysis. Just to go through them very briefly, we see in 1980 no particular pattern across the gender gap at the 10th percentile, the 50th, and the 90th. And the same thing, adjusting in that year for measured characteristics is quite important in terms of the levels of the ratio, but it too does not establish much of a pattern across the wage distribution. But the situation is very different in 2010 when you see in the unadjusted, women at the bottom and middle doing pretty similarly relative to their male counterparts, but women at the 90th doing considerably worse. And this remains the case after you adjust for measured characteristics. It's not due to one group catching up in terms of their qualifications at a faster rate than the other group. So I'm going to refer back to a number of these points as I move along. But before I do that, I do want to say a few words about selection. So of course, the major contributor here to our understanding of the selection issue is James Heckman, who received a Nobel Prize for this. among other contributions. And what I'd like to point out here is even if we just simplify it and consider a point in time, the impact of selection is not clear. When we think about males and people who have looked at this, often are willing to assume that because male labor force participation has historically been so high, that the men who are out of the labor force are likely out of the labor force because they have received exceptionally low wage offers. Now, that's not an unreasonable assumption, but it's not an assumption you can apply to women. Yes, women may be out because on average they've received low wage offers, but they could also be out because they have an extremely high value of home time, or the value of their time in the household. And why might that be? Well, it could be because they're married to very wealthy men or something of this sort. And if they have a high value of home time, they may be out of the labor force, even though their wage offers would be also quite high. So we can't really guess. And then we throw in the fact that in the United States, female participation rates over this period as a whole have greatly increased. Male labor force participation rates have actually decreased. So the direction of the bias is unclear. Now, in this work that I've done with my co-authors mentioned before, we felt that previous work had in some cases used non-representative subsamples of workers or imputation methods that were highly sensitive to assumptions and had produced mixed results. So we developed a preferred approach, and in the interest of time, I won't go into it in much detail. I point you to our paper if you're interested, but we use longitudinal data, and drawing on an insight of a number of years ago of Derek Neal, that enables us to obtain wage data for adjacent years for those who do not have current wages. So we reduce the group who are lacking information on wages. And then we use a common sense approach to assigning wage data for individuals for whom we have no wage information. We do that by extending a contribution of Valvetti and Petrangelo. We use predicted probabilities of their wages falling into each wage decile based on their observed characteristics. We find that my conclusions that there was a convergence, my conclusions mentioned before, based on observed wages, that we do have considerable convergence in the gender wage gap is not an artifact of selection. And this is robust to a number of approaches, including more structural approaches and bounding. Okay, so now let me look at the explanations. I already said in the aggregate, education and experience taken together don't explain much of the gender difference anymore. But an interesting point is that experience and hours worked and labor force gaps, periods of time out of the labor force, are important in high skilled jobs. And you recall that those were jobs where the pay gap fell less. But is it human capital that's the right framework for understanding these gaps? Bertrand et al., who looked at MBAs, emphasized that the wage penalty for any time out of the labor force was really very large for this group. And it's kind of hard to understand how human capital theory can explain that. Do your skills massively atrophy if you spend 6 months away from your employer? So Claudia Golden has advanced a very interesting argument which attributes this to compensating differentials rather than human capital. And in particular, she emphasizes that women have compared to men, given the gendered division of labor in the household, they have a demand for flexibility. And in some jobs, which require long hours and work performed at particular, or prefer long hours and work performed at particular times and particular places, this generates a wage gap because workers who are willing to do this are disproportionately rewarded, and they are disproportionately men. The workers less willing to do this are women, and they have a wage penalty. Again, this seems to especially apply to high-skilled women, especially in law and business. And Golden actually emphasizes a within occupation story, but I think this might help explain some of the occupational segregation we see, where women avoid jobs where this kind of long hours and inflexibility is going to be important. So that's one explanation I wanted to talk about. I also want to talk about discrimination. I mentioned earlier that the importance of the unexplained gap suggests discrimination, but it does not prove it. So what researchers have done is to look at experimental evidence, actual experiments and natural experiments that can complement the statistical evidence and further support the idea that discrimination plays a role. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into details of these studies. I'm going to mention, and this is just some of the studies, that these were hiring, based on hiring. Fascinating, just a fascinating paper by Golden and Rouse that looked at symphony orchestras and the impact on hiring women of auditions that were behind a screen. So the judges didn't know if it was a man or a woman. There's evidence of discrimination and waiters and waitresses in high-paying restaurants, science lab managers. There's a lab experiment in performing math tasks, even math tasks in which there's no gender difference. And one I found quite fascinating is there seems to be discrimination against mothers compared to non-mothers, where there is not such discrimination, in fact, the opposite sometimes, between fathers and non-fathers. But one thing I want to emphasize here, and I think some studies can go astray in this, is you need to be, those hiring studies are sometimes called audit studies. And you need to be aware that interpreting audit test results is more complex for gender than race. Unfortunately, for race, we do expect a negative effect across the board if there is race or ethnic discrimination. But given that the female labor force is characterized by occupational segregation, and indeed segregation by industry as well. So some areas are actually predominantly female and other areas are predominantly male. We don't necessarily expect to see discrimination against women in predominantly female occupations. I mean, there might be, but we don't expect to see that. And indeed, even if we were to see discrimination against men in predominantly female occupations, that's not a helpful finding in terms of reducing the gender pay gap, because these by and large are the lower paying jobs, all else equal, and that's been shown statistically. Moreover, if employers discriminate against men in predominantly female occupations, it may not be simple discrimination. They may just feel, since those jobs are lower paying, the probability of being able to keep a male worker is lower. The same is really true about sorting across firms. Going way back, actually, this is based on my doctoral dissertation, we have found that women, even within occupations, tend to earn less because they are sorted into lower paying firms and establishments. And this is something that a lot of people have gotten more interested in today with matched firm worker data. So if we find that some firms are, employ disproportionate numbers of women and even prefer them, that doesn't mean that that's a lack of discrimination. Discrimination needs to be examined in the predominantly male firms. I'd also like, in pointing to the future, that it would be interesting to go beyond hiring. And there's three excellent studies or areas I'd like to point to, but also really encourage people to think creatively, again, beyond hiring. Some work by Sarsens indicates looks at referrals of general practitioners to surgeons and finds that if a female surgeon has a negative outcome, it has a much bigger impact on referrals on the part of the referring doctor than if a male surgeon has a negative outcome. And in the same way, if a female surgeon has a good outcome, it gives less of a boost in referrals than if a male surgeon has a good outcome. So this points at so many nuanced and important ways in which women may face barriers and obstacles. Recent work on teaching evaluations at the college level indicates negative evaluations or biased negative evaluations against females, particularly on the part of male students, and particularly in non-traditional areas. So this is something that can affect wages and other outcomes in so many ways. It can sap the confidence of women. It can result in women spending more time preparing and working on their teaching rather than the research, which is also important. It can literally, in my university and others, be a negative factor in the promotion. So this is fascinating too, and the kind of thing we need to think more about. And then there's work on negotiating, which is also interested in this context. As I'll mention in a minute, women are less likely to negotiate than men, but experimental evidence has found that they actually, when they do negotiate, they get more negative responses. And I don't just mean they may or may not get the thing that they're negotiating about, but people sort of turn against them and have a more negative view of them because they negotiated. And that is not true of their male counterparts. So I think I'd like to point to the need for more studies that go beyond the hiring issue, but still retain the experimental framework that is very helpful in providing convincing evidence. Okay, taken as a whole, I would argue that the experimental evidence lends support to the idea that at least some portion of the unexplained gap is due to discrimination. By the nature of it, it can't identify a particular magnitude or prove that this is economy-wide, but I find it highly suggestive. I do want to emphasize, and I think this is very important from an intuitive perspective, for people to accept the idea that discrimination does exist. This does not mean discrimination is overt, and I doubt it is anymore. Nobody says, oh yeah, I'm not going to hire you because you're a woman. I mean, they might. In the United States, they'd be asking for a lawsuit if they did that. And it may not even be conscious. That's the finding from some fascinating work by social psychologists who talk about the idea of implicit discrimination. I want to mention also Bertrand and Mullnathan have brought this idea or argued for bringing this idea of implicit discrimination into economics. And it basically argues stereotypes are important, but they may be held unconsciously. And they may influence our behavior even when we're not aware of this. And they have actually developed a test for these unconscious biases. I have a website here if you'd like to try it yourself. One warning I give you is I didn't do great on the test. I mean, I'm a product of my environment as well. And intellectually, I think it's really fascinating that some research is starting to correlate scores on these tests with discriminatory behavior. So that's a very fascinating frontier. Another area that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years is non-cognitive skills. And what this means is some people call it soft skills, psychological attributes, and there's some evidence, primarily experimental, that there are some differences between men and women in various traits. Women tend to negotiate less, although this is very culturally determined. They shy away from competition compared to men. They're more risk averse on average than men. However, I'd like to point out that some non-cognitive skills favor women. Women tend to have higher interpersonal skills and lower behavioral problems. There are lower behavioral problems for boys, for girls than for boys. Some caveats about this line of work, though personally I do find it fascinating, and I think we should continue to do more of it. You shouldn't walk away from this thinking that, okay, I have an unexplained gap, I've just added, 5 to 10 more factors, that's going to just explain all the rest, because some of these gender differences may be captured by measured variables. They could be correlated with occupation, for example, and we're controlling for occupation. As we saw, not all factors favored men, and even the factors that favored men may not be optimal in all circumstances. One study, the one that called attention to the difference in competitiveness, found that in choosing a compensation scheme, women actually competed too little. They did not take the tournament scheme when it would have maximized their income. But actually, men competed too much because they just enjoyed it. So they competed even when it lowered their payoff. Further, as we saw, women may encounter negative reactions when they act in an unfeminine way. So it's really what some people have called a double bind. Well, if you don't negotiate, you pass up an opportunity to boost your pay. But if you do negotiate, people may take it negatively. There's actually a psychological trait called agreeableness. And what they found is that women are more agreeable than men, but you will find it interesting, maybe not surprising. It's disagreeableness that's rewarded in the labor market for men. But women aren't necessarily rewarded for being disagreeable. So this makes the whole thing quite complicated as to what the impact of these differences are on the pay gap. To the extent we've mainly used lab experiments, we have an issue of external validity. How does it affect the real world? And though it is difficult to measure the quantitative importance of these factors, in our 2017 paper, we did correlate the studies that use statistical techniques and statistical measures. And what we found is that, yes, there was a modest effect, but it was not the silver bullet that's going to help us explain the remaining gender difference. And I think in the interest of time, we can come back to this, but I will leave it at that. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much more on two important factors that differences in occupations, although those can also reflect discrimination. But what I want to point out is that these are very much reflective of the gender division of labor in the household. And that generates what Clavin and other researchers in a recent line of work have called the child penalty. We're having a child, again, due to gender differences in the household division of labor, set women on a path of lower relative earnings and wages compared to men. So let me close with some comments on policy. And I want to talk about three broad policy areas. And I do mean comments. I don't want these to be taken as thoroughgoing assessments. Family-friendly policies that will attack these supply-side differences related to the division of labor. Wage-setting institutions, which we sometimes forget about, which are apparently neutral policies that can disproportionately affect women, and anti-discrimination laws. So in terms of family-friendly policies, the two main ones I'd like to mention are parental leave, although another one folded in there in some countries are what are called part-time mandates, where workers, after having children, have the right to request part-time work for some period of time. And I'd like to point out that this is an area where I think there's an optimal length of leave, though I don't know exactly what it is. So on the one hand, if leaves are too short, and I would put the United States in that camp, where thankfully we do have leaves now. We were one of the last countries to get them, but they're just 12 weeks of unpaid parental leave. If leaves are quite short, it may result in lower employment levels for women, and women exiting the firm and maybe the labor market because they're unable to get back in that 12-week window. On the other hand, in many other countries where there's a paid leave of considerable duration, we may have the problem that leaves of over a year, for example, encourage women to stay out longer than they would otherwise, and may actually encourage employers or incentivize employers to discriminate against women in certain types of occupation where labor force attachment is quite important. This is what some research, Larry and I did some work on this, Chris Room and there's others, suggest there may be a trade-off between very extended parental leave, which does encourage employment, but may have a negative effect on gender equity within the labor market. For example, we found that in the United States, the share of women in managerial and traditionally male professions was higher than in other countries, though our employment rates were lower due to our very skimpy parental leave. And on the other side, childcare and subsidies and provision of childcare does not have this problem. because it is helping individuals address work-family issues, but in a way that strengthens their attachment to the labor force and minimizes the time out of the labor force. In terms of wage-setting institutions, I'd like to point you to a line of work that Larry and I did a number of years ago, where we called attention to the role of unions in government in wage setting. And in particular, where unions in government tend to increase wage minimums across diverse units. So for example, in the United States, where unions have union coverage is very low, we have enormous diversity in pay across firms and industries. Where unions have a more powerful role and are more centralized, they tend to equalize those differences. Since in all countries, women are disproportionately at the bottom of the wage distribution, minimums that bring up the bottom, either the bottom of the whole wage distribution or the bottom of the wage distribution within various occupations or lines of work, they disproportionately benefit women and reduce the gender pay gap. So I'd like to point to a potential role of wage-setting institutions, an apparently neutral policy that has a disproportionately positive effect on women if it brings up the bottom of the wage distribution and reduces wage inequality. Now, this has increased in importance recently due to two opposing developments. On the one hand, due to globalization and other factors, we've seen a considerable, in many countries, decentralization of wage setting and reductions in wage regulation. And so this is a trend that we should keep our eyes on as potentially adversely affecting women. Okay, potentially adversely affecting women. And I think there has been a little study of this that's borne this out, but I think we could have more. On the other hand, in the United States and perhaps some other countries, there's renewed interest in raising minimum wages to counter growing wage inequality. And that's where the recent work that I mentioned that's in progress, we're looking at, well, what if the US does adopt a $15 minimum wage or whatever? What would be the consequence of that? And what we found is that it does boost female wages relative to male wages, but it has relatively little impact. Well, in the United States, it just affects the very lowest wage deciles because we have such relatively low minimum wages. Now, let me say, I'm not advocating these policies, I'm just trying to explain them because there's, of course, potential employment effects that one might want to consider. And then in the few minutes I have left, I want to talk about anti-discrimination laws. I would argue that my presentation says they're of continued importance. There's no reason, even with the declining gender pay gap, to consider discrimination a thing of the past. There have been a number of recent initiatives, and so I am just going to mention them here. One is reserving some corporate board seats and quotas for women. It's an interesting idea. It's started in a number of Scandinavian countries. It is unclear at present how much impact this has. It has a theoretical, it has an empirical base in some more descriptive studies that found having more women in decision-making roles does tend to increase relative pay of women, but the early work on where these quotas have been established does not yet suggest the general impact on women's wages, just really of women at the very highest levels, close to these corporate boards. Comparable worth is another thing we could have a whole session on. I just want to mention what it is. It's the idea of using job evaluation techniques to evaluate the skill, effort, and responsibility of jobs, and to realign pay rates based on these evaluations, which generally means bringing up wages in traditionally or predominantly female occupations. Has that consequence. Clearly a very controversial idea among economists because it is potentially very much interfering with the wages set by the market. And in the United States, it has been implemented just in certain localities. So we're still gathering some evidence on it. It had a big impact on female wages in Australia a number of years ago. So it's something to keep an eye on. And then finally, each of these last two ideas, very new ideas, and there is some evidence, but it's in very early stages, that they may have a positive impact on gender pay gaps. One is salary history bands. That means when you hire someone, you're precluded from asking them what they currently make elsewhere, or when you're interviewing someone, with the idea that by getting someone's salary history, you actually are importing general market discrimination into the firm. So banning that question, and the other, which they've got some interesting positive results on in the UK, is salary transparency. Publishing salaries, making them public knowledge, and this apparently has reduced gender wage gaps to some extent, but the evidence is really early on both of those. So let me conclude by saying that women have made significant and dramatic progress in the labor market, but of course inequalities remain. Personally, I feel there's no single unified explanation. It's a combination of supply side and demand side factors. Looking to the future, sexual harassment is a very important area with very little work done by economists at this point. And I think it could potentially be an important explanation because women who harass, the evidence suggests, generally don't file complaints, but they move. And in moving, they forego any firm-specific training. So that has a negative effect on wages. The other thing, which I don't know how you get a handle on, is things women may have to do to avoid sexual harassment. You know, if they can't attend meetings in hotel rooms, like we found in the Harvey Weinstein case, well, if that's where most of the meetings are, then what happens to them? If they can't go out for drinks with clients who have a bad reputation, then what happens to them compared to their male colleagues? And finally, one point I did not emphasize is that some of the women's gains in recent years do reflect men's losses. So less skilled men are faring particularly poorly, even though less skilled women are faring poorly as well compared to the more skilled counterparts. They are doing a bit better. And the fates of men and women are, of course, intertwined by the family. Either the contributions men can make to intact to two-person families, or the growth of female headship. So I think I'm within my time bounds. Let me stop here and see if there's some questions or comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Francine, for this perfect explanation of what has been happening in the US about the gender pay gap, and also for tapping on some of the policies that could help, like help with this situation. As you may mention, this dramatic progress, but at the same time, the inequalities remain, and we have to be vigilant and trying to progress on that. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to post the questions to you. The first one is from Francisco Flores, and he says that some authors see, for instance, Breda et al.'s 2021, suggests that part of the gender pay gap can be explained by individuals' self-selection to occupations. In particular, they indicate that women avoid male-dominated occupations like STEM occupations, engineering and tech, which tend to be the most rewarding professions. So how do you think gender stereotypes influence that phenomenon?
The great question. I absolutely agree that what I would call occupational segregation, the tendency of, in this case, of women to not be well represented in these high-paying male jobs, it's extremely important, and it underlies my decomposition, where I found actually what Larry and I found for the most recent year was occupational differences between men and women controlling for everything else explained 1/3 of the gender pay gap. And we had a large number of occupations, but we did not have the full list of detailed occupations. So it's very important. Is it supply or is it demand? And what could be done about it? So I definitely agree that women may have some preferences that contribute to this. There may be preferences about the nature of the jobs or the difficulties of entering entering as a minority to male-dominated areas. I'd also point out that we don't know the role that discrimination may play. It may play a role as well. So even if the choices that women make are a factor, discrimination could also be a factor. And that, by the way, is one reason that we always in our work break out that factor separately, because we do want to acknowledge that the decisions employers make could play a role as well. But bottom line, figuring out how to address this, very important for closing the remaining gender pay gap.
Well said. Thank you, Francine. The second question is from Oscar Diaz, and he asks, is there any research on the impacts of reducing imperfect information on wages? For example, policies asking companies to be open about salaries would work?
So if I'm understanding the question properly, does it would reflect my point on wage transparency.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So this would be policies that it could be at various levels. In the UK, I think firms might have had to publish average male and female wage rates. In some legislation in the United States, where they're starting to do this a little, they want to remove penalties against employees for sharing information on wages. In some firms, actually, they say you cannot tell your coworkers what you're making. So this is a real barrier to formal or informal efforts to reduce wage discrimination. You can't even get the information on it to know if you're making less. So again, we don't have too much evidence on this, but it looks promising. It does look promising. Oh, by the way, I would say some research on this shows that it could have some negative effects in other areas. So some professors who work for state schools, or professors who work for state schools, their salaries can be published. And what the research suggested is that people found out they weren't doing too well. There's a real decline in demand, and they're sort of thinking of leaving, So it's kind of hard for employers when this information gets out in certain circumstances.
Yeah, that's right. One final question, Francine, we have a couple of minutes only. It's from Daniela Pugioni. And it says, what about behaviors that are not explicit discrimination? Those that in your presentation you referred as adverse reactions to behaviors or decisions perceived as unfeminine. What policies could we implement to change those?
Well, it's a terrible problem. I mean, how do
Yes.
you get inside the heads of people? And again, they might not even be conscious. Sometimes there was a case in the United States, a pretty important court case, where it was all documented, where a woman was one of the most successful in one of the big 8 accounting firms. And they did not promote her to partner. And they said things like to her over the years, she should dress better. She should wear more makeup and jewelry. I mean, it was really laid out there, but it isn't always. And I think it's kind of, to me, it's kind of doing 2 things. At Cornell recently, we had a discussion for, especially aimed at women, how to handle seminars. And I don't know how you feel, but a number of people feel the culture in economic seminars is quite unfriendly to the speaker. And
Yes.
Recently it's been found that disproportionately affects women. And so we feel this is not good, and we're looking at policies to change it. But what this workshop did was also give women tips about how to handle these problems as they came up. What if somebody asks you something like this? You know, how do you respond to this? How do you respond to that? So, and they have classes for women to negotiate, maybe in some ways that don't set people's backs up as much. So I think on the one hand, it may help women to be aware of it, not to not do the right thing, but to try to figure out the best way to do it. But on the other hand, to raise people's consciousness of these problems, and so they can try to examine their own behavior. And then when we see differences in outcomes, if we focus on outcomes and we see that women with similar qualifications, characteristics, etc., didn't get the promotion, didn't get the wage increase, then we have evidence, whatever's causing it, that it has to be addressed.
Great. Thank you so much, Francine. And with this, we came to the end of this session, and we would like to thank you, especially to you, for this very interesting presentation, and all of the audience as well for being connected, asking questions. There were many questions. Sorry that we didn't have the time to post those to you, but thank you to everyone. And there is a lot to do. That is a lot, like a big agenda for this topic. And I think it's important for the researchers that are interested in this to encourage them to continue working on this. It's a very rich agenda for the future. So thank you to you, Francine, again, and to everyone who participated in this session in this great LACEA conference. Thank you, and have a good afternoon, everyone.
It was my great pleasure. My great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francine. Bye.
Bye.